Probably the most iconic adage in American sports is offense wins games, defense wins championships. We've all heard it countless times, and it sounds great, but is it true? Specifically, in 2025, in the NBA and NFL, my two areas of expertise that I want to investigate today, does the idea that defense wins championships hold water? After all, the saying is an old one. It was originally attributed to legendary Alabama football coach Bear Bryant, who was talking about college football in the 1970s. He was focused on one level of one sport in one era, and his first national title did indeed come with his team allowing 2.2 points per game. So there's no question Bryant's statement was true for Alabama football in the 60s and 70s. And at the end of the day, he was trying to get a banger off, and he did. But that sentiment continues to deeply resonate with many sports people decades later, who identify with the idea that as fun and flashy as offense is, the key games are ultimately decided by grit and hard-nosed play on the eternally less celebrated side of the ball. So Bear's saying has had a great life, and when he said it, he wasn't anticipating that a handful of decades later, some nerd kid would hold up a microscope to his words, much less in reference to the NBA and NFL, two leagues in which he was not involved, now in an entirely different era for sports. But Bear Bryant simply was not prepared for an MF like me, and although he made the claim in one specific context, its influence has extended so far beyond that. So, men used to work in the coal mines, and now they get curious and conduct an in-depth analysis into whether or not defense is as important or even more important than offense when it comes to winning championships. That's our mission for today, to analyze the accuracy of the claim that defense wins championships as it applies to today's NBA and NFL. But I do also want to look back to see if the statement was once more or less true by examining how the dynamics have changed over the modern histories of both sports. For what it's worth, I do have a hypothesis. As someone who spends too much time watching and studying and thinking about both leagues, I predict the old saying is actually going to be inaccurate. My instinct is that in both sports, elite offense will be slightly more common among champions than elite defense. Of course, I do expect balance to be the most consistent trend, with most champions being quite strong on both sides of the ball, although I foresee some more outliers there in the NFL. Just intuitively, I can think of more lopsided Super Bowl winners who were carried by either side of the ball and more lacking on the other. And in general, there are just more wonky Super Bowl champs because the NFL playoffs use a small sample size, single elimination format. In the NBA, the best team almost always wins it all, and that is not the case in the NFL. So that's my prediction. But hey, the games aren't played on paper, right? In this case, of course, the games have all already been played, and the analysis from this point forward will be fully conducted on metaphorical paper. But let's see if I'm right. And more importantly, let's find the truth. In both sports, I want to examine two major indicators. First, the regular season offensive and defensive performance of each champion. This gives us a large sample size view of what made them all great in the big picture. But of course, the claim we're testing is whether or not defense wins championships, which would mean that once you get to the postseason, it is the teams that play the best defense in those crucial games that win out. So to measure that, we'll also be looking at postseason performance on both sides of the ball to see where the champions were at their best in the biggest games. As a sample for this analysis, we're going to look at every champion in both leagues since 2010. I believe this gives us the best picture of what makes for a champion today, because although both leagues have certainly undergone significant changes in play style and strategy since 2010, looking at the last 15 years offers us the best balance of looking at the recent history of the sport without overly shrinking the sample size. If we were only to look at the last 5 to 8 champions, I'd worry about outliers skewing results. I don't think that's quite enough data points to draw definitive conclusions. So let's start by looking at the NBA. Here we have the regular season relative offensive rating and relative defensive rating of every champion since 2010. Relative meaning how many points better than league average the ratings are. The best offenses are higher on the graph and the best defenses are further to the right. And that's going to be the same for any graph that you see today. The first clear takeaway here is that every champion was at least above average on both sides of the ball in the regular season, which speaks to just how essential a reasonably high level of balance is. Most NBA champions are very good at both scoring and getting stops, as we'd expect. Now, the degrees to which they excel on either side of the ball do vary, of course. We have a cluster of teams here who were more carried by their offense, a cluster here more carried by their defense, a couple of almost perfectly balanced champs, a few juggernauts who were excellent on defense but even greater on offense, and one more who was excellent on offense but even greater on defense. But overall, we're looking at quite a balanced picture here. So, if we break it down, out of the last 16 champions, we saw one more number 1 offense win, the same number of top 5 offenses and defenses, and 3 teams that were not a top 10 offense compared to 2 that were not a top 10 defense. This would suggest that recent champions have been essentially identical in their excellence on both sides of the ball. But the cutoff points for these rankings are ultimately arbitrary. We just like talking about top 5 and top 10 because they're nice, clean numbers, but they really only show us the broader trends. When we use the most accurate point of comparison and average the relative ratings on both sides of the ball, we do see that in the regular season, our champions were slightly better on offense than on defense, with an average relative offensive rating of plus 3.99 versus a relative defensive rating of 3.3. But what about when we look at the stretch of games that decide it all, the playoffs? In the biggest games against the best competition in the path to a title, on which side of the ball do champions set themselves apart more? Well, this is the same graph of every recent champion's relative offensive and defensive ratings, but now in the playoffs, with the ratings judged relative to the postseason averages of that year. Immediately, we notice a couple more outliers on this graph. The 2021 Bucks, for example, won the title with a relative offensive rating of negative 1.4, below the average in the playoff field, but they were able to overcome this by posting the best playoff relative defensive rating of any champ since 2010. No other champ in this period was that lopsided, but you may also notice the 2011 Mavericks also just over the boundary to the left here, as they posted an ever so slightly below average playoff defensive rating, which they overcame by posting an elite playoff offense. And Dallas is part of a trend that stands out here. Like, what happened to the cluster of teams here from the regular season graph? The group of champs with above average offenses and very good defenses. They've almost disappeared. Meanwhile, the cluster of teams carried by their offense has grown into a full-sized army, even featuring a few teams who in the regular season were in the other cluster, like the 2022 Warriors, 2020 and 2010 Lakers, and the 2012 Heat. These teams were stronger on defense in the regular season, but elevated to become markedly stronger on offense in the playoffs. A couple of surprising champs like the 2011 Mavs and 2016 Cavs both also reached another level on offense in the playoffs, with the Cavs posting the best relative playoff offense of any team here at plus 8.8, literally jumping off the chart. So, among our recent champs, there's a significant group of offensive playoff risers, and there are simply fewer examples of a recent champ doing the inverse, markedly elevating relative to the playoff competition on defense. The 2018 Warriors certainly did it, but that was extremely predictable because the almost identical 2017 roster was a dominant defense, and they just coasted on that side of the ball in the next regular season. But perhaps the foremost legitimate example of that improvement in my mind is the 2023 Nuggets, a pretty average regular season defense that was able to maximize its personnel in the playoffs and post one of the better playoff defenses that year. Do they win the title without taking that step up defensively? Probably not. But do you know what they certainly don't win the title without? The best offense by far in the playoff field that year, which was their strength the entire season and got even better in the playoffs. That's what they leaned on. And a clear through line here is not just elite team offense, but those elite units being led overwhelmingly by an all-time great offensive player, the sort of guy who can individually elevate in tougher playoff circumstances and still create excellent offense for his team. Every one of these champs that took a notable offensive jump in the playoffs was led by an all-time great offensive player who reached an extraordinarily high level in that run. If it was LeBron, Steph, Kobe, Dirk, or Jokic. So let's be clear about something. You have to be a serious playoff defense to win the title. And in one sense, pretty much every team defends better in the postseason because there's no question that the overall defensive level picks up in the NBA playoffs. Teams maximize their defensive preparation, physicality, and effort for the sprint of the playoffs in a way they do not during the marathon regular season. But to be carried to a title by a defense, recent champions had to reach a ridiculously high level on that side of the ball, such as the 2019 Raptors, 2021 Bucks, or of course, this past year's Thunder, who were one of the greatest defenses we've ever seen and still a top 5 regular season and playoff offense. And there's only a few of those examples. The bar to being carried to a title by defense is simply higher than the bar to being carried by an offense. So defensive intensity picks up universally in the NBA playoffs, but in that environment, generally, the most valuable ability is to truly excel on offense and generate elite results still on that side of the ball to create more separation from the pack there. Accordingly, since 2010, 2 more number 1 playoff offenses have won the title, 4 more top 5 playoff offenses have won it all. 10 of the last 16 champs were relatively stronger on offense than defense in the playoffs, and the relative efficiency gap is more sizable than in the regular season, with an offensive average of plus 4.6 and a defensive average of 3.3. You may notice that relative defensive number is actually identical to what it was in the regular season, but the relative offensive number has gotten higher. So the average NBA champ not only stands out more on offense than on defense, they stand out more on offense in the playoffs than the regular season. This aligns with my hypothesis, but I did wonder if there might be something nuanced missing from this data that could slightly undersell defense, because not all stops are perfectly equal in value. I talked about this a lot in reference to this year's Thunder, who forced turnovers at a historic rate, which also created more easy opportunities for their offense in transition, making their defense even more valuable than their already historic defensive rating would indicate. Plus, their overall dominance in the turnover battle allowed them to consistently win on the margins. Maybe that's a key that the simple ratings aren't capturing. But in fact, among our sample, there is no significant correlation between forced turnover percentage and being a champion. It just happened to be a crucial part of the Thunder's formula, not the formula. So, does defense win championships in today's NBA? Well, it certainly can, but not as much as offense. But has that always been the case? Absolutely not. If we start by looking at the 1960s, which I consider effectively the beginning of meaningful NBA history, the league was ruled by its greatest defense ever, led by the greatest defender ever. The Boston Celtics won the title as the league's number 1 defense 8 times in that decade, and they won the title as a below average offense 9 times in the decade. At the time, offenses were more limited by both skill and the rules, and with every basket being worth 2 points, and teams therefore wanting to live in the paint, a truly dominant rim protector and defensive big man like Bill Russell was the most valuable asset a team could have. He set Boston apart by more on defense than anybody could for their team on offense, and therefore nobody could beat the Celtics. Defense ruled the world. But after Russell hung him up, no defense ever replicated that level of dominance. Offenses evolved and improved, though in the 1970s, rim protection was still of the utmost importance, and defenses did still have a bit of an upper hand on offenses. As you can see, your average champ in the 1970s ranked slightly higher on defense than on offense, but the trend of balance being the biggest key was established in the 70s. In the 80s, the NBA experienced a major offensive boom and was dominated by perhaps the greatest offense the league has ever seen, the Showtime Lakers. But then, from the mid to late 90s into the mid 2000s, pace slowed down dramatically, and offensive efficiency league-wide tanked as defensive big man talent reached perhaps an all-time peak, returning the power of balance back to the defenses, with champions like the 99, 03, and 05 Spurs, the 08 Celtics, and of course the 04 Pistons, winning the title on the back of dominant defenses with less than stellar offenses. But offense has exploded again in the last 15 years to unparalleled heights, with the pick and roll revolution and the massive increase in the use of the three-point shot at the center of it. Offensive skill, spacing, and strategy are all the best they've ever been. Defense has also evolved and improved a great deal to keep up, which often gets underrated, but still, offense has just evolved a little faster. Maybe the Thunder, with their unparalleled speed, switchability, and activity defensively, as they basically only play strong defenders, could lay a blueprint for a new era where defense becomes the dominant side when it comes to winning rings once again. But it seems unlikely. They are, at least for now, one of a kind on that end of the floor. After all, with optimized spacing and high-level skill all over the court, certain offenses today feel almost unsolvable. And in a game where offense is thriving and the ball is ultimately in their court to put up points, great offense, on average, beats out great defense. So that's where the NBA stands. But how about on the old gridiron? We'll start by again looking at regular season performance, this time using points per drive scored and allowed relative to league average. I wanted to use an all-encompassing offensive or defensive efficiency metric like EPA for these, which would account for the value of certain big swing plays like sacks or turnovers, but their database only goes back to 2018, and we need a bigger sample than that. So we'll use scoring, offense, and defense on a per drive basis. And as we look at the regular season numbers here, we immediately see that balance is not quite as ubiquitous in the NFL. The 22 Chiefs had a dominant offense, but a slightly below average defense. The 2015 Broncos were a bad offense, but a great defense. And the 2011 Giants were just super mediocre, a bit above average on offense and below average on defense. Both Denver and New York barely even fit on screen here. Some would say that means the graph is poorly scaled. I would say I just take the phrase off the charts very literally. And these guys should be barely on screen because they are huge outliers. But with a few exceptions, most of these champs are still relatively balanced. Among 15 teams, we have 12 top 10 offenses here and 11 top 10 defenses. So compared to the NBA, there are more teams who are mediocre on one side of the ball in the NFL, but still not many. Overall, these champs outperformed the league average per drive by a slightly wider margin on offense at 0.35 points than on defense at 0.27 points in the regular season. So that's another point for offense narrowly. But the NFL playoffs are where things get really interesting. Before we move on, I just want to point out that the regular season graph is scaled to range up to 0.8 points per drive better than league average on both sides of the ball. For the playoffs, I had to more than double that scale on the offensive side to go up to +2 points per drive and move it up to 1.5 points per drive better than average on defense, while leaving room over to the left here for the defenses letting up considerably more points than average. There's a ton to unpack here, but the first thing to notice is that on this graph, There are a shit ton of teams over in this top left quadrant now. Those are the teams who are outperforming league average scoring offense by a lot and outperforming league average scoring defense by just a little, or maybe even underperforming it. On the flip side, the right half of the graph, those teams being carried by their defenses, is extremely sparse. Shout out to the Denver Broncos, though. The best playoff defense and worst playoff offense here by a mile. And some of these playoff outliers on offense are absolutely ridiculous. Teams like the 22 Chiefs, the 19 Chiefs, the 17 Eagles, and the 14 Pats almost doubled league average scoring production per drive in their playoff runs. Now, the first obvious point to bring up here is that the NFL playoffs give us a much smaller sample size than the NBA playoffs. In the NBA, a champion will usually play 20 to 25 postseason games. In the NFL, they will play 3 to 4. This inherently creates much larger outliers in the NFL, thus the doubling of the scale. I'll also point out that because of the small playoff sample, I'm comparing all these NFL points per drive statistics to the regular season league averages of that year, unlike the NBA, where I compared ratings to the postseason averages. I'm doing it this way because there are only 13 total games in the NFL postseason, and it was 11 until 2020, whereas there were 84 NBA playoff games in 2025, which gives you a much more legitimate point of comparison. So, a small sample size creates more outliers, of course, but among these outliers and overall, the trend here is very consistent over 15 years. The party is going on over here, which means Super Bowl champs are consistently elevating their performance on offense in a massive way in the playoffs. You have teams like the 2019 and 2022 Chiefs, who in the playoffs were allowing teams to score at a well above league average rate, and yet they were elevating their own offenses beyond their elite regular season production to a truly ludicrous level. And again, they're just extreme examples of a clear trend. This is a crazy stat. If we look at the difference between our champions' average points per drive on both sides of the ball in the regular season compared to the playoffs, we see a massive leap in average offensive scoring production in the playoffs for championship teams, while their defenses actually allow slightly more points per drive in the playoffs. And 14 of the last 15 Super Bowl winning offenses averaged more points per drive in the playoffs than in the regular season, while only 4 of the last 15 Super Bowl winning defenses allowed fewer points per drive in the playoffs than in the regular season. This is a striking difference. But I know what the defense lovers here are going to say. Hold on a second. That's actually impressive from the defenses because they're allowing similar numbers to their regular season averages, but against better competition in the playoffs, where they're facing elite offenses. That means actually, on average, their defenses are still stepping up. And this does make some sense. So let's have a look at opponent-adjusted playoff data from our champions. I can't find this at a per drive level anywhere, so we're going to look at things at a per game level now and measure how many more points per game our champions scored against their opponents than those opponents usually allow, and how many fewer points per game our champions allowed their opponents to score than they usually put up. In some ways, this feels more appropriate. For example, it gives more credit to the 2011 Giants defense in their run, which feels right as they held elite offenses like the Packers and Patriots of that season in check. But although this opponent adjustment does paint a more balanced picture and definitely makes the defenses look better than the previous graph, nevertheless, it is still, on average, the championship offenses that perform more impressively than their defenses in the playoffs, outperforming their opponents' averages by 9.9 points on offense versus 7.9 points on defense. And regardless, there's another key point to address here. The opponent adjustment makes the defenses look better compared to the raw numbers, Because elite offenses are more likely to make it deep into the playoffs than elite defenses. And elite offenses are more likely to make it deep into the playoffs because offense is more important. We can give the defenses credit for almost maintaining their typical numbers against better competition, but what does that then say about the offenses far exceeding their regular season numbers against the best competition in the playoffs? Well, it tells us a couple things. First off, it is unquestionably more important that your offense reaches an elite level in the 3 to 4 game stretch needed to win a Super Bowl than your defense. And it also tells us a fact that perhaps we all already know. Great offenses are harder to stop than great defenses are to score on. When we discuss the great defenses in today's NFL, we don't expect them to stare down elite offenses and crush them into oblivion. No, the hope is just that they keep them in check, not to stop them, but to slow them down. Gone are the days of the 85 Bears holding their opponents to 3 points per game in the playoffs, or the 86 Giants holding their playoff opponents to 7 points per game, or the 2000 Ravens holding their playoff opponents to 6 points per game. The best offenses are just too good for that now. The 2024 Eagles had the most impressive defensive run we've seen from a championship team in some years, and they still allowed the Rams to score 22 and the Commanders to score 23. Meanwhile, it was Philly's offense that elevated to score a ludicrous 3.4 points per drive in the playoffs. And I want to be clear, I view the 2024 Eagles as a genuinely dominant defense, but that doesn't quite mean what it used to in terms of shutting out opponents. And even if we think of their defense first, and we always will, we can't undersell that their offense also elevated to a truly elite level in their Super Bowl run. The reality here is pretty simple. Great defense is very valuable, but great offense is essentially a prerequisite for contention. You are not going to beat the peak Chiefs with Mahomes or Josh Allen's Bills or the Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry Ravens in a 13-10 grimy defensive game. It's just not going to happen. And you're certainly not going to beat them all like that. You have to be able to put up points. In today's NFL, when it matters most, it is consistently elite offense that prevails. However, there is one more point that we have to bring up when talking about Super Bowl defenses. As I mentioned earlier, talking about NBA defense, not all stops are created equal, and this is especially true in the NFL. One turnover can completely flip field position and swing a game. Multiple turnovers can be insurmountable. So I wanted to investigate how many of our Super Bowl winning defenses were elite big play units, excellent at generating sacks and turnovers. Averaging all of their combined totals, I found in the regular season they were good, not great at both. And in the playoffs, I found they were good, not great at generating sacks. But at generating takeaways in the playoffs, they were exceptional, forcing 1.96 turnovers per game. That is an extremely high number. Extrapolate it to a 17-game season, and that's 34 takeaways, which would have led the NFL each of the last 3 seasons. On the flip side, Super Bowl winners are also excellent at protecting the football, averaging just 0.94 turnovers per game, which is not quite as ridiculous as the defensive number, but still an elite mark. And this is very intuitive. The NFL playoffs are single elimination. One bad game and you're out. So it makes a ton of sense that our champions would be the ones who never shoot themselves in the foot and maybe get a little lucky or at least make a couple very timely plays that sink their opponent. On top of the basic prerequisite of being a great team, that variance going your way in a 3 to 4 game stretch is hugely important if you want to win it all. Now, it is fair to wonder if these defenses, with their takeaway excellence, are actually positively skewing the championship offense's points per drive numbers by disproportionately setting them up with short fields. But If we look at yards per play, championship offenses still clearly outperform their defenses in the playoffs, and in the years we do have EPA, the championship offenses also rank higher on average in the playoffs. Plus, the offenses are also doing a great job of not making their defenses defend short fields because they're also never turning the ball over. So that doesn't ultimately change the picture here. So, in today's NFL, offense does win championships more than defense, markedly so, by a bigger margin than in the NBA actually. But we can also say the turnover margin wins championships in the NFL. That's just not super catchy. But was there a time when defense, first and foremost, won Super Bowls? Well, if we start at the beginning of the Super Bowl era and go through the 1970s, we see similar regular season performance from the champs on both sides of the ball, but true defensive dominance in the playoffs. Although it certainly wasn't as dramatic as its NBA counterpart in the 1960s, I do believe that defense had a leg up in both sports in these early stages against less skilled offenses and with more favorable rules for the defense. And Logan would have my balls if I didn't mention that the Steel Curtain defense is the defining unit of this time. I'd consider the 80s another decade where the story was told a bit more by the dominant defenses. Washington in 82, the 85 Bears, the 86 Giants, but the defining team of the decade was the 49ers, who excelled on both sides of the ball. In the 90s, it was the elite offenses who dominated more. The Cowboys, the Steve Young 49ers, the Packers, the Broncos, the greatest show on turf. In fact, the league's #1 offense won 5 Super Bowls in the decade, and a top 3 offense won it every year but one. But the 2000s, particularly the early part of the decade, saw perhaps the most defensive-centric run of champions we've ever seen, including the Ravens, Bucks, early Patriots, and Steelers. So, without a doubt, there have been plenty of stretches where defense won championships, arguably most of the Super Bowl era before the last 15 years. But in those recent years, offense has become king, as the NFL, like the NBA, has undergone a massive offensive evolution. We've seen passing production and efficiency skyrocket, the rapid blossoming and realization of dual threat quarterbacks, more use of tempo and screens and RPOs and spread concepts, and creative pre-snap motion, and an ever-increasingly insane offensive talent pool. And although defenses have countered, and offensive production has come down a bit in the last couple years, offense remains on top overall. So we've done the research and we have our conclusions, but there's one more fact I want to mention that applies to both of these sports, and it further supports the idea that on average, it is more valuable to have the best offense than the best defense, that the two sides of the ball are not equal. This is it. In each of the last 5 seasons, in both leagues, there is a bigger gap between the best offense and the worst offense than there is between the best defense and the worst defense. On a per possession basis, the best offense scores more points than the worst defense allows, and the worst offense scores fewer than the best defense allows. Think about that. It means there is more of a performance gap between teams on offense than on defense. There is measurably more of a range of outcomes on offense, which also indicates to me that a team's offensive performance is generally slightly more important because the upside is greater and the downside is worse. In other words, offense wins games and offense wins championships. I feel like I've known this intuitively as an avid fan for some time, so maybe this isn't a massive revelation for anybody, given offense has evolved to such incredible heights in both sports. But I had a hell of a time actually digging in deep to quantify the difference in value and truly examine what makes a champion. So I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Of course, one last time, balance and strength on both sides of the ball is the biggest key to being a great team. And of course, we are talking about averages here. In both of these sports, the greatest strength of the most recent champion was defense. you can absolutely win a championship on the back of great defense. But the bar there is higher, and winning it all without also having a very good offense, which both of those teams also did have, is very difficult. So look, every great team and every champion is a little bit different, which is awesome. But on average, if you had to choose between an elite offense and an elite defense, take the points. They're more fun and they'll win you more chips.